Hello there, you perfectly lovely little people. My name is Sarah, and this evening I'm going to be reading chapter 6 from 101 Dalmations by Dodie Smith, and this chapter is called To the Rescue! As they walked the Dearleys home, Pongo said to Mrs., "Did you hear who owns the house where the puppies are imprisoned?" Mrs. said, "No, Pongo, I'm afraid I missed many things that the Great Dane barked." "I will tell you everything later," said Pongo. He was faced with a problem. He now knew that his terrible suspicions were justified, and it was time that Mrs. learnt the truth. But if he told her before dinner, she might lose her appetite, and if he told her afterwards, she might lose her dinner. So still he said nothing, and he made her eat every crumb of dinner, and then join him in asking for more, which the nannies gave with delight. "It may be a long time before we get another meal," he explained. While the nannies fed the Dearleys, the dogs made their plans. Perdita at once offered to come to Suffolk with them. "But you are still much too delicate for the journey, dear Perdita," said Mrs. "Besides, what could you do?" "I could wash the puppies," said Perdita. Both Pongo and Missis said that they knew that Perdita was a beautiful puppy washer, but her job must be to comfort the Dearleys, and she felt that herself. "If only she could make them understand why we're leaving them," said Mrs. sadly. "If we could do that, we shouldn't have to leave them," said Pongo. "They would drive us to Suffolk in the car and send the police." "Let us have one more try to speak their language," said Mrs. The Dearleys were sitting by the fire in the big white drawing room. They welcomed the two dogs and offered them a sofa, but Pongo and Missis had no wish for a comfortable nap. They stood together, looking imploringly at the Dearleys. Then Pongo barked gently, "Woof, woof, woof, woof." Mr. Dearley patted him, but understood nothing. Then Missis tried, "Woof, woof, woof, woof." "Are you telling us the puppies are in Suffolk?" said Mrs. Dearley. The dogs wagged their tails wildly, but Mrs. Dearley was only joking. It was hopeless, and the dogs knew it always would be. Dogs can never speak the language of humans, and humans can never speak the language of dogs, but many dogs can understand almost every word that humans say, while humans seldom learn to recognise more than half a dozen barks, if that. And barks are only a small part of the dog language. A wagging tail can mean so many things. Humans know that it means the dog is pleased, but not what a dog is saying about his pleasedness. Really, it is very clever of humans to understand a wagging tail at all, as they have no tails of their own. Then there are the snufflings and the snifflings, the prickings of ears, all meaning different things, and many, many words are expressed by a dog's ears. It was with their eyes that Pongo and Missis spoke most that evening, for they knew that the Dearleys could at least understand one I word. That word was love. And the dogs said it again and again, leaning their heads against the Dearleys' knees, and the Dearleys said, "Dear Pongo, dear Missis," again and again. "They're asking us to find their puppies. I know they are," said Mrs. Dearley, never guessing that, as well as declaring their love, the dogs were saying, "We are going to find the puppies. Please forgive us for leaving you. Please have faith in our safe return." At 11 o'clock, the dogs gave Mrs. Dearley's hand one last kiss and took Mr. Dearley out for his last run. Perdita joined them for this. She'd spent the evening with the nannies, feeling that Pongo and Missis might wish to be alone with their pets. Then all three dogs went to their baskets in the warm kitchen, and the house settled for the night. But it did not settle for long. Shortly before midnight, Pongo and Missis got up, ate some biscuits that they had hidden, and took long drinks of water. Then they said a loving goodbye to Perdita, who was in tears, nose upon a window at the back of the house, and got out into the mews. They knew they couldn't open the gate at the top of the area steps. But carefully they nosed the window shut so that Perdita would not get a chill, and then they went round to the area railings to give her one last smile. Dogs smile in various ways. Pongo and Missis smiled by wrinkling their noses. She was there in the kitchen window, bravely trying to wag her tail. Beyond Perdita, Mrs. could see the 3 cushioned baskets in the rosy glow from the fire. She thought of the many peaceful nights that she had spent in hers, in the happy days when a dog could fall asleep, looking forward to breakfast. Poor Mrs. Of course she loved Pongo, the puppies, the dearlies and the nannies, and dear kind Perdita, best of everything in the world, but she also loved her creature comforts. Never had her home seemed so dear to her as now when she was leaving it for a dangerous, unknown world. And it was such a cold world. The night was fine, the stars were brilliant, and the wind was keen. If only she could have brought her beautiful blue coat, now hanging on a peg in the warm kitchen. Pongo saw her shiver. It was a hard thing for a loving husband to see his wife shiver. "Are you cold, Mrs.?" he asked anxiously. "No, Pongo," said Mrs., still shivering. "I am," said Pongo, untruthfully. "But I shall soon warm up." And he tail-wagged goodbye to Perdita and then started briskly along the outer circle, because luckily the gate to the area had been left open. Mrs. kept pace with him, but after its last wag to Perdita, her tail went down. After a few minutes, Pongo said, "Are you warmer now, Mrs.?" "Yes, Pongo," said Mrs., still shivering, and still her tail was down. Pongo knew if he could not cheer her up, she would never be able to face the hardships that lay ahead, and he thought he could do so with some cheering up himself. So he began a little speech intended to give them both courage. "I sometimes think," he said, "that you and I have become a bit pampered." "Well, pampered does do dogs no harm, providing they don't come to depend on it. If they do, they become old before their time. We should never lose our liking for adventure, never forget our wild ancestry." They were then passing the zoo. "Oh, I know we're worried about the puppies, but the more we worry, the less we shall be able to help them. We must be brave. We must be happy. We must know we cannot fail. Are you warmer now, Mrs.?" "Yes, Pongo," said Mrs., but still she shivered, and still her tail drooped. They were now nearly at the bridge, which led from the outer circle towards Camden Town. "Stop for a moment," said Pongo, and he turned and looked back along the curve of the circle. No car was in sight, no light was in any window. The lampposts were like sentinels guarding the sleeping park. "Think of the day when we came back with 15 puppies running behind us," said Pongo. "Oh, Pongo, are you sure?" "Absolutely sure," said Pongo. "Are you a little warmer now, dear Mrs.?" "Yes, Pongo," said Mrs., "and this time it's true." "Then onwards to Suffolk," said Pongo. And as they ran towards the bridge, Mrs. carried her tail as high as his. "Not too high, Mrs. dear," said Pongo. "Let our hearts be happy, but not our tails. For when a Dalmatian's tail is curled high over the back, it is called a gay tail, and that's a bad fault." Mrs. was still laughing at his little joke when her heart gave a wild flutter. Coming towards them was a policeman. Instantly, Pongo led the way into the back street, and then they were soon safe out of the policeman's sight. But seeing him had reminded Mrs. of something. "Pongo," she wailed, "we are illegal. We're out without our collars." "And a good thing too," said Pongo, "for a dog can be grabbed by the collar. But I do wish we could have brought your coat." He had noticed that she was shivering again, though this time it was because she'd been scared by the policeman. "I don't," said Mrs. bravely, "for if I wore a coat, how should I know how cold the puppies were? They have no coats." "Oh, Pongo, how can they make the journey from Suffolk in such wintry weather? Suppose it snows?" "They may not have to make the journey yet," said Pongo. Mrs. stared in astonishment. "But we must get them back quickly or the dog thieves will sell them." "Nothing will happen to them yet," said Pongo, and now he knew it was time to tell his wife the truth. "Let's rest a moment," he said, and led Mrs. into the shelter of a doorway. Then he went on gently. "Dear Mrs., our puppies were not stolen by ordinary dog thieves. Try not to be too frightened. Remember, we're going to rescue them. Our puppies were stolen by Cruella de Vil's orders so that she can have their skins made into a fur coat. Oh, Mrs. Be brave. Mrs. had collapsed. She lay on the doorstep, panting, her eyes full of horror. But it will be all right, dear Mrs. They will be safe for months yet. They're much too small to be used for a fur coat yet. Mrs. shuddered. Then she struggled to her feet. I will go back, she cried. I will go back and tear Cruella de Vil to pieces. That would do no good at all, said Pongo firmly. We must rescue the puppies first and think of our revenge later. On to Suffolk. On to Suffolk then, said Mrs., staggering along on shaky legs. But we shall come back, Cruella de Vil. Soon Mrs. began to feel better, for Pongo made her see that puppies whose skins were wanted for a fur coat would be well fed and well taken care of and kept together. Ordinary dog thieves might have sold them already and to different people. She asked many questions and he told her of his early suspicions, how he had suddenly recalled the evening they had first seen Cruella and sat under the piano in the red drawing room. She said, we would make enchanting fur coats, Mrs. For spring wear, over a black suit, said Mrs. remembering, and she did take a lot of interest in the puppies. And she kept Nanny Cook talking. Well, they were stolen, said Pongo, but I wasn't quite sure until this evening at the twilight barking. You didn't hear as much as I did, Mrs. Our puppies are at Hell Hall, the ancestral home of the de Vils. And he knew, though he kept this from Mrs., that the SOS on the old bone meant save our skin. Oh my goodness, this is getting exciting. Well, my little precious, I hope that you've cleaned your teeth, washed your hands, and I want you now to get into your bed, snuggle up, and have a great big cuddle. Night, night, sweet cheeks. I'll see you tomorrow.